Well, hello, everybody. Again, this is the second lecture that is going to be held by Scott Joy. Scott Joy, as we said yesterday, is a professor of the ATH of Zurich, and he belongs to a urban think tank chair, who is already involved in teaching and researching on informal city and informal architecture. He is professor, as I said, in Zurich, and for today is professor here in our school. You are welcome again, and feel at home, as in home. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. So,
today I'm going to show mainly the project we're working on in South Africa. Last night I showed a little bit about the work, the research work and the other project work, but here focusing on Cape Town and a little bit looking at how we work and how we approach the real city, or the other side of the city, and in developing countries which are home to some 1 billion people who are living outside of the formal city framework. So it's quite a dynamic and increasingly or rapidly growing field of research. And it's something which we see as at the limits of architecture, where we try to expand our knowledge and our reach as architects. And I think this is a theme for the future, and it's a theme that architects need to address now, and definitely coming from the university system. These type of contexts are going to be the future of the 21st century city. So to understand how they work, understand how they can affect how you read the city and how you act as an architect is going to inform the next generation of how we build cities, or how cities are built without us. So I call this geography of opportunity. This is one of the most iconic images, which was taken in the late 60s, the first time the world could be seen from outside. And we look at that and say a geography is a physical area of this globe, and it's shaped by physical conditions, the population, land use, the state, and laws. So the interconnection of all these different actors and all these different systems are what we're looking at. And if we can find a disconnect or a connect between these different systems, then we have a project. And those projects come to us through different means, but the main theme is that we go and look for these projects as well. So we find most of our projects, or we develop our own briefs for these projects, and that's probably an active way of applying your architecture knowledge. And we discussed before, like, what was the role of the architect? And everyone says, well, it's to make the world a better place. But I think that's an ideal which we can step back from and say, the least we can do is make more inclusive cities, or cities which work better together. And both look at the informal city. This is an image of Caracas. On the right side, you see the city which is ungoverned and informal. 400,000 residents are living here. On the left side, you see the formalized city. So if architects can at least address the informal and the formal, and understand it's not just like this image between black and white, it's actually, these systems work very, very much together. So if you can find out how they're working together and where architecture can then express that, then we have an interesting task. So again, from the other perspective, so from the informal city looking down into Caracas, we say what we can do is offer the people access to the right to change the city. So they can have not just access to the city or the right to the city, but the right to actually shape the city in their own image. And there's a lot of pressure on the formal city to be different and to have a different form. And we're interested in taking that momentum and taking that pressure to create these projects and to fulfill a certain deficit which we know is happening in these developing cities. So the first thing we do is to try and find out what is missing in these cities, and we do that by starting an engagement with communities, with oppositional groups, with NGOs, with people who really need or are marginalized by the certain city systems which we kind of take for granted, which are surrounding us here in Europe. But the ambition is to fulfill certain deficits through an architecture or through architectural programming. So a direct example of this is the government proposed road system, which would try and connect the barrios in Caracas to the main city. It would have actually taken out all of the red houses you see there, which would have completely changed the fabric of the city and changed the living conditions of all those directly and indirectly affected. It would also cost an incredible amount of money for the government to do this, and ecologically it would actually disturb the general water patterns of the hillside. So the urban think tank then proposed a different way of approaching such a mobility system and said, well, what if we actually can access the hilltops of the barrios by creating a mobility system which didn't cut through, but eventually went over the top. So connecting the high tops of the hills there into the formal city network, the metro system and the bus system, and actually allowing access from the informal city into the formal city. So in this situation, you have the people living on the hillside, they're actually working, of course, in the city. They're either working in the black market in the city selling things, or they're working in different service jobs in the formal city. People in this side of the city actually go into the barrios for cheaper goods they can buy, materials, supplies, also through the black market. So there is already a connection between the two, I would say, and this just helps us to really make that or manifest that. This was something like in the mid 80s, I think it was called. Maybe Placido, you know more about this. This was always just the green zone. It was labeled by the government as the green zone, which was the hilltops. And then with more visibility and more understanding of what this actually means, and it means there is 400,000 people living there, then this suddenly becomes onto the city map as part of actually the city in itself. So Alfredo was telling me a story where he was speaking to the mayor, and the mayor said he could never, this was his map, because he preferred this map, because if he had this map, his budget wouldn't allow him to take account for 400,000 more people in the constituencies. So it's an interesting where you draw the boundary and where you actually open up the boundary and say this is actually the real city. This is interesting aspect. The project I showed last night is the vertical gym. It just shows this a little bit more clearly. This came from a site which was an abandoned building site, but it was used as a soccer field and a basketball court. And it also came up from a local meeting, saying we have to find something for the youth and the kids to do. You know, there are certain gang elements and crime were quite prevalent in this area. The idea was to create a vertical gymnasium to allow a higher density of programming, of sports and cultural programming. And this was constructed on the site of what would have been just one court. It is now 4 stories with a running track around the outside, different sports offers, and becomes also a community center. We like to call it like an urban generator. So it allows for the community to come together. It keeps the children off the street, the youth off the street, and certain things like resurveying the area after creating such a hub. We can see that the crime rate is dropped significantly. There's some studies saying that 30% less crime in this immediate vicinity comes directly from those who actually have something to do during their days, and they go and play sport and they join sports clubs, and that's something which we can measure. And we can measure and say that is something of a positive aspect to the urban project. Another project which I showed last night too, was the autism school. Here we designed a ramp around the outside of the whole building because the children with autism have difficulty with orientation. So this becomes like the main mobility access to the building. And the center core is also a vertical. There's an area for gymnasium and classes and that sort of care. Currently in São Paulo, we're looking at the music school, which is a similar construction as the vertical gymnasium, while stacking programming on top, creating a higher density cultural center, but also then looking at a landscaping element, finding out different ways to connect the ecological system and making the building, of course, the qualities which we consider to be best contemporary architecture. So looking definitely at creating architecture solutions. We're interested in being good architects, but also to create the projects which have a broader impact on society, not just for the architecture profession or the magazines or the architecture press. This was one of the first real focused studies on the informal city, produced by the Urban Think Tank, and it was pretty much an introduction into this theme, and one of the first collections of all these projects and analysis and other actually formed the whole history of urban history of South Africa. You may be aware that there is the apartheid regime, which was the official structural planning policy of South Africa for about 50 years, from 1948 to 1994. It took on different systems, but the idea was that planners and the government would create, through certain mechanisms like division, isolation, and the force of law, that have complete control over the urban territory. So it's we look at a typical apartheid planning scheme here. Shows that the government this would be a typical plan which would be projected over the cities around South Africa. The plan was to have the white upper class in a certain area. The white middle class would surround the white high-income earners, which would then be surrounded by the white lower class and white working class. There would be introduced different buffer zones between the white lower class to the what is called the colored group, with the colored Indian and Asian populations. These were then split by an industrial belt, which would be this one here, the industry, leading directly into the city and directly into the bureaucracy. The white lower class would run the industry, and then the black South Africans would be then put to a side, also separated by a physical barrier like a highway system or a train line. But this is like the high point of modern planning design, and it wasn't just to say your color and your race here. There would also be a certain hierarchy of privileges given to these different races. So the ruling elite would then say the colored population can have this access to land or this access to mobility, but the black South Africans not. So the black South Africans would look to the colored for that also be a conflict between them and try and divert the conflict to the ruling classes. In the 60s, this got to the high point where the government actually planned to completely remove black South Africans off the urban territory and created townships. So these plans were designed by military planners. You can see, of protest, which were becoming more violent and more visible. And this increasing unrest was taking different forms, also rent boycotts and sabotage on infrastructure. So the government kind of knew that this was coming to an end. Like the one-party system was becoming pretty much in its last days. The ANC started negotiation with what would be the ruling party, the ANC. Here was the President de Klerk speaking with Mandela. This is probably after this happened. So there would be a negotiation to the transition from a one-party state into a democracy. But this negotiation took on a form where the government, existing government, made sure that they would contain control of the economy, while the democracy would allow a symbolic representation of whoever was elected to the head of state. So there was, things would not change on the economic side and the structural side of the country, but there would be a symbolic democratic system, so someone could be at least represented on the side of the people. So the elections happened in '94, and as everybody knew, the ANC took power, or at least took representative power, and enshrined into the constitution, which is pretty much similar to in Caracas, where the housing becomes really a defining tool for a populist party, where they say that everyone has the access to housing, to adequate housing. So every citizen of South Africa has access to housing. This was written into the constitution. So when they talk about housing, they talk about the private block. They talk about the RDP project, which was about giving everybody who was earning under 3,500 Rand per month access to one of these type of houses. So it's a
What's the meaning of RDP?
Reconstruction and development project. Yeah. So it's a major project which said, how can we then distribute private property to all the citizens of South Africa, earning under a certain amount, and offer then free access to water and electricity and a small yard and a house like this. The strategy for doing this was actually originated from the National Housing Forum, which were also chaired and influenced by certain bodies like the World Bank and by also the economic advisors of the country. So it is to spread private property around and create a discrete housing unit, and the promise of making 1.5 million houses in 5 years kind of takes on really epic proportions until we get to the real figures, which are, the original promise was 1.5 million houses over 5 years, but now we see that there is a housing backlog of 2.4. Gini coefficient, which shows how well this wealth is distributed throughout the country. And you can see there, South Africa is probably one of the most unequal societies of wealth distribution. So that thing means that there is money, it's not being distributed, or it's being distributed in very obscure ways. So that's also part of our research to find out what that thing means. So in Cape Town, we're working, this shows the race distribution in Cape Town. You can see a part of this is the city center here. pink dots refer to every 50 people. The pink dots are white population. Between the white population and the blue population, the black South Africans, there is the colored area populations and the Asian population. So that's a legacy of apartheid planning, which was in 2001, based on a survey of people identifying themselves with a race. So it's not the government saying you are a particular race, but ask the people themselves, do you consider yourself to be white, colored, Asian, or black South African? So 2011 to 2011, I'll just go back there. So 2001 to 2011. So you see that over 10 years, nothing really has changed. Like there is very much, it's very stable where people are still living as a result to the type of planning mechanisms. The major change is that if you look at maybe in the blue areas, there are some more, more of the higher upper class neighborhoods. You have quite an influx of wealthy black South Africans, which come directly from, of course, the power which they've got now in the government systems, and that's probably the most the greatest change. This shows a map of where the housing estates are, the new housing estates which will be planned. They're generally within quite a radius outside the city center. And Kailicha in the bottom right there, that's where we're working. So it's an informal settlement in Kailicha. This just shows the condition on the ground, a little bit more diverse than what people can imagine. And you see the strip in the center is the real informal, ad hoc, and unplanned city. On the bottom, you see the RDP estates. The top there, the lower middle class suburb. In the middle there, one of the buffer zones. And you can see that there's actually an integration of the informal city here. You can see it's in certain pockets coming through. So the idea of this clean split between informal and formal is obviously something which we don't, it's far more diverse than that. Part of our research was to go and interview people in these areas. This is Linda, and she received one of these free houses from the government, but she can't afford the electricity. So she cooks her meals on this petrol burner in her living room. So there you know that the poverty over determines the kind of housing option. He also received an RDP, one of these houses from the government, and he sold it and now lives back into in the settlements. So he's relatively wealthy because he sold his house in the secondary market, took the present from the government, and then moved back into the informal settlement. This is William, and he works as a security guard in and which is right here. And our first idea, our first thesis, which we discussed with the NGO, is if we can organize the people to actually, oops, didn't happen there. Ah. Sorry. Second. Okay. No, but nothing at all.
It's even worse.
Okay.
Restart must be the solution, the only solution.
Reset the computer.
Yes. Restart over there.
Okay. Sorry about that.
¿Podrías hablar a Ciudad?
Yo no sé, porque a mí no me ha pasado.
Es la primera vez que veo que falla en una aproximación. Si tú eres en el archivo de tu equipo,
Claro. 24 vídeos. Por 2 minutos de receso.
I tried to do this enmarca.
Do you have a keynote on here?
You have
tienes un USB.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the presentation now, actually.
Un 37.
You have a keynote? Doesn't seem to want to transfer. Maybe I can just it's taking too long to transfer. I don't know what's. Maybe I can just run it here. Is it?
Zit dat in een PDF?
It's no.
If you want, copy the file.
It's just not. It's taking a long time. Yeah, next time I'll bring in a print form next time. We can just
Bring a piece of chart just to go.
That's not working. Okay, we try and transfer it. It wasn't moving over. Problem is I don't see it here. I don't see the file here. So I don't know where it's actually.
Open the Finder.
Enough room on your folder.
It's very strange.
Enough space here. It's too small.
Okay. ¿Qué tiene esta lleno? Espera.
It's weird, no?
Or email me it.
Huh?
Email me it. Email me the file.
It's 1 gigabyte.
Oh.
Here it works, huh?
Shit happens.
Yeah. Okay.
Copy the file.
Yeah.
¿Tienes otro?
Sí.
Okay. Is have it here? Do you want to set this up now on this one here?
Bueno. No, it is this.
And keynote is where is
Keynote.
keynote?
You have to.
Oh.
Se está copiando el archivo al USB.
Right. We hope there's enough space here on the, because there's a film inside there, so I think that's quite a huge space.
We hope there will be enough space on the USB.
Weiß ja, du. Less than 1 minute.
Es que pesa 1 tera y pico el archivo, entonces... 1 tera no, 1 giga, vamos.
Can you open? Top. Not there.
¿Por qué no sale lo que estamos viendo?
Explícale a la gente lo que está pasando.
Sí. Bueno, estamos ahora mismo, hemos copiado el archivo de la presentación en USB y estamos intentando abrirlo en este otro. Lo que pasa es que es un archivo que pesa bastante y de ahí la demora de tiempo. ¿Qué? Sí. Bueno. Lo que pasa es que lo que no entiendo es por qué no se ve en la pantalla esto. ¿Y cuál es para poner este? Ahora está abierto. Bien.
Okay, sorry for the technical hitch. I just go straight to where we left off. Okay, so back to the BT section. This is where we started off. This is what we consider our pilot project. And the idea is we went and mapped out where the houses are now. There are between 180 and 220 people who are living in these houses here. They all made their own house and they all occupied this block of land on one night 18 years ago. So the shapes of the houses were dependent on how many people they had with them who went to the site to occupy the site and how much material they actually could take on site with them. So the urban formation was actually created on one evening. So we're looking at that and saying we need to reorganize this dense urban setting so we can actually start to create courtyards where we say that people can hang up their washing without the fear of it being stolen. We can have courtyards where children can play in and not play on the streets. We have roads and safe access through the dense urban fabric so people can work safely during the night if they have to go coming through the settlement. Also, so we can actually lay down infrastructure afterwards. but also mainly it's about creating a safe environment also for making fire breaks. So when a fire starts somewhere, it doesn't take off the whole city. So by organizing the shelters or the houses in such a range, we can actually win in this case 40% of the public space. So we have 40% more space to work with, based on the condition that we actually go 2-story on occasion on some of those houses. So we upgrade the house, we shift it into a formation which allows public space, thoroughfares, and fire breaks, but it's based on having to go up to another story. So part of our research was to go around the immediate area of the BT section and to look and investigate who has already done this. So there is a precedent for people who are building in 2 stories. This house here we investigated, they built their own house, they needed more space, so they built a 2nd floor. At the time, the residents thought these guys were quite crazy to go up another floor. It's quite windy in Cape Town, and without access to the right materials and the right knowledge of how to build, you can see this house here is starting to fall down. This whole back part is pretty much will eventually fall. It's based on these type of structures going into the ground. They weren't sealed. It's rotting, that particular core at the back. We went and investigated the whole structure. And this is, although there is actually a desire or a precedent for building like this, we need to know how to do it safely and to offer a certain way of doing that. This person works in the construction section in part-time, and he built his own house because he wanted a car park for his car underneath there. So he lives on the top there, and his car is parked underneath where his kitchen also is. So we went and investigated all the square meter public, or the land which people have created for their houses, analyzing every single house on the block and coming up with the conclusion that if we offer the chance for a 2-story house, we could reduce the footprint, go 2 floors, but only on certain square meter of footprint. So if somebody has 30 square meters, we can offer them maybe a 20 square meter footprint if they go 2 floors. So we take public space back to the community, and we decrease the private footprint by going vertical. But it can't happen with every house. So the objective now was to say, if we can actually start upgrading the houses, putting them in a new formation, what kind of formation would that actually be? So there is a desire to live in clusters. So we can create these courtyards, different type of courtyards, different type of access through the site. We're looking at 3 different widths of access. One is 4 meters, which allows for fire trucks and emergency crews to go through. 2 meters for like a civic street of some sort, and 1 meter for general permeability. So the question here is then, how do we actually split up these clusters? And you can see here on the left is a way of saying, if we make clusters which allow for the streets to be, or the land to be passed through in this direction, you can't cut a line through the site and remove people from the site. So it's actually, that's a way to actually defend a certain occupation by how we would plan. And the other options are to the right, where we say, no, let's plan so we can actually find a way that we can upgrade later. So if this is the new layout, we can possibly offer different forms of housing for people who may not be able to afford the maintenance of their own house. So we can say, can we build even more dense, more permanent, and then offer rental housing, for example. This is just some scenarios we're looking at now. Because the situation here is that nobody owns the land. It's owned by the government. So actually they're squatting on the land. It's actually an illegal occupation, but the government can't remove them off the land because there's too much resistance and too much organization in this particular case. So they are tolerated where they are. So we're working in a very gray area. But the government won't tolerate if people build with bricks or with concrete or anything permanent. So we must build something or offer a building typology which is light and easy to build, and it must be easily demountable. That's part of the design brief we gave ourselves. So the government lets us or lets the NGO at the moment work with temporary housing, but we're trying to find a way where we can make temporary housing in a city construction which still gives the impression of permanence, like what a city actually should have. So we are looking again at the cluster situation. We say that the community already has community leaders, and these leaders would then take a cluster and look after the cluster. So we're trying to make the management of these environments localized, and that will actually help in the whole security and the social contracts that we make on a smaller scale. Just looking at particular formations, we can start to say that the courtyards can have different programs. Afterwards, there is an urban agriculture program happening just off-site at the moment, and the people are learning about that. And the idea was to say, if we can create a system which is based on a fixed width, and we offer people who have now a certain width, they can actually have the same amount of space afterwards, but we just put them into an architectural format, which is based on a 4 meter 10 width, and that can be extendable in both ways. Part of the research is working with another department which deals with computational analysis. So they're looking at our plans and seeing how, for example, how dangerous they are with the fire transmission, for example. So we take our plans and we send them off to those guys who are the computer nerds. They go and they do the stuff and they bring it back to us, and we can analyze that data and see if we're getting any closer to what we want. This is just a quick render showing the different offers of what we're dealing with now, mainly with using the materials and techniques which people use right now. So this is quite a strong metal profile which clips in to each other. It's very secure, it's very strong, it's fire resistant, and we're allowing then taking that into a second floor. But the one on the left here is a second floor house, but only one floor. So later the person can then upgrade vertically when they have the resources. The expression of the architecture there is not important right now. We're very much at the early stage of the architecture, and how we use the facade and what materials that's going to be is the next step. But we know we want to make courtyards, and we can organize that if there is a demand for that kind of layout. This is us in the center where we're connecting a lot of different departments. As I said, the computational analysis, we're working with local NGO, looking at how we can put all these thinking and all this analyzing onto a platform that the NGO can actually use later and even scale up. Working with the local microfinancing team, a sanitation team, and the structural engineers. So we're bringing all that together, focusing that on the site of the architecture. The research in low cost and lightweight materials brought us into creating a library of parts that we can actually then offer. And we think the biggest task here is that we can actually offer access to these materials, and we have a growing library of different options which we can offer. And for us, taking inspiration from an English architect called Walter Segel, he creates an architectural framework which is based very much on low cost, off-the-shelf materials. And because the community there, they do have savings, and the NGO only works with communities who have a savings, so they can afford to to pay for materials, they just don't have access to them. And when we can actually say how we can create a framework where we can then add materials and take materials away, and if a material breaks, we just go to the warehouse or to the delivery system we're developing to replace those materials. So it's very much based on a core structure, and the materials can be changed depending on what people can afford and what access they have. And these ideas came from a workshop we started in 2013, where we had the students design and build one full-scale prototype, and they built this in 9 days. So we got together on the first day, we had a series of programs, we invited guests, we went to a warehouse and started just putting things together, really testing out materials. And at the end of the 9 days, we got a design, which was this one here. It's all based on, as I said, the modular system. Every component has to be light enough that 2 people can carry it. It has to be small enough to be able to transport through the settlement, the small widths of the settlements. And it has to all be packed onto a truck and be built in 1 day. So that was the task that we gave ourselves. Because another issue is that people don't feel comfortable with taking their house down, getting a new house, but during this time, all their possessions are sitting on the street and waiting for the new house to come. So if we can't do it in 1 day, then we've kind of failed. So the idea was to make a very efficient system. We worked with Pumezo, who is a community leader. He came to Switzerland to work on the workshop with us. We couldn't take the Swiss students to South Africa. We didn't have the budget for it. So we brought Pumezo to us and the NGO to us and a community architect also to us. So there were 4 representatives from this community coming to us to develop up the prototype. We then took what the students did and what we did with the students. We refined the design. We made the prefabrication process, which could be taken care of in a day. So 1 day prefabricating, 1 day on site. And we took this to site, and the local builders put that together. There was some improvisations on the site. So they were taking the designs and there was certain knowledge which they brought to the table and said, well, we can actually make a joint here with some timber scraps just to make it a little bit more solid. And all this was put up within the day. And that's the house. So we have other ideas of how to take it to the next step, and that is to allow for ventilation in the summer, and also allow for a very simple mechanism. You can see on the top of a detail of a cool roof system, which allows ventilation to go through the tin roof and the upper living floor. So air is then circulated through the ceiling, and you can see it just comes out the top bit and at the bottom bit with a simple piece of timber with holes drilled in it and some mosquito netting across there. So the roof would cost about 1 month of income for someone to upgrade to a ventilated roof, which is quite a necessity in this area. They can do that like that. And some of the considerations we're thinking also is that in the bottom floor is where the cooking takes place. We have a magnesium board floor, which is like a plaster board, but a very high density, lightweight. So when people are cooking with these petrol burners, if they tip these over, then the floor at least doesn't burn. But also if they're cooking with these burners, we can't actually make a very tight building envelope. If it's too insulated and people are cooking with petrol burners, then you're gonna get these fumes, which are actually quite dangerous. So the idea is to create, we're calling it a warm cell. So upstairs you can sleep and be warm, and downstairs has to be actually permeable for air to move through. So we don't insulate downstairs because it would be dangerous compared to the practice of cooking. but upstairs is where we at least have the insulation and the warm zone. So part of the task is also to create an accessible financial system. And we're saying, if we can tap into the rental system, which actually already is happening on site, then we can actually finance, help finance what is happening here. So we've decided to take away 10% of the land and say, let's actually use that for rental housing. So we can design or build more houses, but then offer them out to new people coming to the site who will then pay for the upgrade, like in a monthly rent. And in order for that not to be the situation where the people paying for the upgrade are isolated from the community, we're distributing that 10% rent throughout the clusters. So each cluster has one rental house, which is helping us pay for the whole upgrade. So looking at different scenarios of laying out the settlement, it's all based on our discussion now with the community. So we're going to the community and saying, we have different options for how big the courtyards are, for how many houses are surrounding one courtyard, and what that formation could look like. I mean, we don't really care what the formation of the city looks like, as long as it has basic access routes and it has certain qualities which we consider can help the current conditions. So the next step is to say, well, what kind of options we have. Underneath, you can see the existing township, and on top of that, you can see one scenario from us. So the red is single-story housing, the striped is the rental housing, and the blue is double-story housing. The red one here you can see is the house we already made. So the strategy now is we can't wipe off all the houses and start again. We have to actually start by removing one house and then upgrading one house, and then removing the next one and upgrading the next. So that's actually quite a complicated task. This is a decision theory illustration of a game of tic-tac-toe. So you make one move, which is the top left, and then every other move you can do after that is your possibilities get smaller and smaller. So to strategically upgrade the whole settlement, one house at a time, we have to start removing certain houses which are in the way of our future building sites. Okay, so house number BT 32, I think it's called, is covering the building site of 3 houses. So this one we would consider a priority house to move first. So when we upgrade that house, we have 2 extra building sites to move the other houses into. So we have developed a questionnaire which goes out to all the community members. The community members are asked, firstly, are they ready to upgrade? Do they have the finances, their savings already in place? Are they involved with a microfinancing program? What is their desired outcome? Who would they like to live with? What kind of clusters they'd be most comfortable in? And it helps us to know what the community wants, but it also helps us to plan how we're actually going to upgrade the whole system. This also comes into an application which we're going to be giving to the NGO in order to be able to run this digitally, to collect all the data, to do the surveying, to do the photographs, to do the questionnaires. So it's all in one field document. So we started also at the university to start to say, well, if we're going to upgrade, it's going to be something like this. It's going to be then removing a house and then replacing a house and removing a house and replacing a house until we have the desired layout of what we're doing. So it's not only thinking about what we can do for an architectural case, it's saying if we can come up with a methodology which is based on this questionnaire and based on the software which helps us decide how to lay out these houses, then we can offer this 2-story prototype and the single-story prototype and make it dependent on how people want to live in these cluster sizes. So this is one scenario of about 1 million or so. And next step is to pick up more information on site, which will be next month, to find out exactly what size formation and how people actually want to live in that constellation. So I guess the main lesson is that the whole process is being refined and changes every time we go to site, and the more information we pick up from the community, the better it's affecting how we actually can approach this upgrade. And this particular case, as I said, is a pilot project, and the findings we're going to be learning from that should then influence the next steps, which the idea is to create a scalable approach to upgrading. So when we leave, the NGO can take the methodology, can take the other systems which are plugging into the upgrade, and move to another site and then do the same process there. So it's architecture, but it's also planning, strategy, bringing in different experts when we need them. And in the end, we hope for some sort of a action like this. So that's the latest stand of the project is this, and we move. Then we'll be in Cape Town next month to consult with the community about the next step, which will be the clusters and the design of the prototype. So that's just it. That's the short preview into the project. It's a 3-year project, so maybe I can come back in 3 years and show you what's happened in the meantime. That's it.
Do you have time for questions? Okay, it's time for questions. I'm afraid they are not going to ask enough right now. They will ask me.
That's all right. That's fun.
So, some questions, please. If you are expected today, some questions. Okay, I have a few ones. May I?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, first of all, you have talking about to allow people to shape the city. These projects plans to allow people to shape the city itself. How do the people are involved in the project, in the design process?
Firstly, we work with communities or NGOs who are, especially communities who are organized. And I think as soon as a community is organized, they can like articulate their needs. And once they can articulate their needs, then it actually becomes them who are shaping the brief. I think if you shape the brief and say, this is what we are missing, this is what we are willing to work towards, and then actually by articulating that and communicating that to the architect or the designer or the city council, that's taking a first step in taking the responsibility to get the city they want. I think it's definitely to shape the city in the image of your own self. That's more of an ideology, but to take the first step in saying, well, what do we actually want? And to articulate that in such a form, we help articulate that as well, because we have the tools to present and communicate that. But it's definitely the first step is you have to be organized and have a vision. And I think that's the start of shaping the city.
So the first question, maybe ask the people if they want to remain there, to remain in the site. Maybe the first question you ask them.
Yeah, of course. What's the ambition? Like, what is their ambition for the future?
What's the first question you ask the people when you finish your work? When you finish the houses?
The first question we ask them?
Yeah. When the buildings are occupied.
Well, there's many questions, but we have a survey, a post-occupancy survey. So we go around it and make sure the building is architecturally or it's constructed in a way that we know it's sustainable. But then the questionnaire for the people who live there are more like what has changed in their life, and what would they do as an improvement, of course, to the building? What are the faults of the building, and what are the faults of this building happening here and now? Because we know we're working in an area where if you come in with ideas and with different systems, you definitely change the power balance of what's happening on the ground. The distribution of power and privilege in the community is established itself over a very long time. So whatever you do disrupt that in a sense. So we definitely say, what are the repercussions of these people who have now access to some upgrade? So it's looking more at a sociological side of things. That would be done through questionnaires and surveys. But there's many questions to ask, and the ambition and the result, the feedback directly and indirectly, that's all part of a questionnaire which we'll do later to make sure we know that what we're doing is feasible.
What about the local architects? I mean, it's quite strange for you as architect to go abroad and to work local people. Is it much more easy for local people to be understood by a foreigner architect rather than by a local architect? What do you think about it?
I think that this wouldn't work if we didn't have partnerships with the NGO. Like if we came as foreign architects and just said, listen, I see a problem and this is a solution, that probably wouldn't work. I mean, we have to establish a trusting relationship with an NGO who has a trusting relationship with the community. And all through this process, we are in dialogue with local architects and with local universities. Like we do make sure we're sharing our work and listening to the feedback, and that's part of the work too. Like knowing what the context is, not just for the people who are the end users of the work, but also the academic environment and the social environment, which have some influence on how that whole thing is going to be received. So to work completely isolated is not the way to do it. Of course, you must find a way to come in sideways and not down.
Any other questions? Yeah.
No? What services does the houses have? Sanitary ones, electrical?
At the moment, or what we are planning?
What you planned and what is finally built?
So we will plan different. I'll try and get to the map. Let's do it from here. We will plan different. Once we have some streets and we have some like straight lines, we can plan in then sewage lines. We can plan in water lines, and every other infrastructure which comes later. So it's all retrofitted after the fact. We build the houses, then we build the infrastructure, because we can't build infrastructure when this house is already there. So we have to remove the houses step by step. And because all the houses are lifted off the ground because of the flooding, we can put infrastructure underneath. So this particular case, they are connected to the right next to the formal network, like the sewage and the electricity and water. But most of the houses, there is a tap, a public tap here. There's water mains here, public tap here. And I think these houses here, they all have their pipes which go into the public. They cut the public mains, put their tap on there, and draw the water back to their house. So we would like to then formalize that and make sure it's a little bit more safer and more efficient with the infrastructure. And with electricity at the moment, it's just been taken from the council electricity lines. So people come in and they attach their house to it, and but we would like to make that safer, of course, and that's also one of a potential reason for the fires, because there's so many electricity lines all kind of attached to houses, and so to formalize that as well would be a step to create a safer environment too. So there are many different ways of adding infrastructure afterwards, and it depends on people's financial capacity and what's the best way to do it. But right now, people generally they get the services themselves.
Black waters?
Sewage.
Sewage?
Used waters.
at the moment, or grey water just gets dissipated anywhere. There is a sewage pickup system, so that people in these houses, yeah, they have buckets, they have toilet seats, and they do the business in the buckets. They get picked up on Tuesdays on this main street here. So, and there are some public toilets on the top there, and some on the streets in the bottom there. So, we're working with an NGO who do sanitation pickup, and they can come to the house, pick up the sanitation of the ablution, take it to a site, treat it, and make fertilizer. So they can actually make money from that. So that's part of the system to say, what things can you actually give away, what things you can actually sell, what systems are working to make the services suit this type of needs. So it's an interesting part of the project too.
There's another question.
I was thinking about, I think it was Steve, who made some social houses, and the users didn't like it. They wanted to make some changes, like make bigger rooms or things like that. Were the people in that place really happy with the design, or did they want to change things?
The adaptation, yeah. So what the structure I was saying before, or at least the reference we're using, because these are all in modular systems and based on, so this is not the house, this is just a reference image, but we have a library where people can have access to the tools and to the materials required to extend their house in like vertically if they don't have vertically, or then horizontally, because we're giving each house a zone where they can actually expand upon. So not only just reorganizing the structure, every house has an area where they can develop in the future based on either these technologies or their own. So if they need to add on an extra room, they can add on an extra room. Yeah.
Do you have any help of the formal building industry? I mean, with this library, are they really committed with this library?
This is our research. So our research, like we know these materials are available, and
Are common solutions?
they're off-the-shelf solutions. So there's either insulation, there's a cladding, certain footing techniques. So to actually, we have a large warehouse which is in the area from where we're upgrading. They have access to that too. So
In lower prices, maybe?
yeah, the NGO buys everything on bulk, so they can store materials in a large warehouse. And the idea in the future would also be to offer a service which helps deliver these materials as well. So that's probably one of the biggest issues if there's no access to these materials. There is a desire for it. There is a way to stay on the site, to occupy the site without being permanent, but there is a lack of access to these certain materials. So
Okay, more questions? Well, the very last, what do you bring back home when you finish your work in your language? I mean, not in the physical language, in your mind.
don't mind.
What do you bring with you back?
Oh, it's always a trauma when I come back to Switzerland. And it's really reflecting on the complexity of the site and the complexity of the situation, which we will never fully understand. And I think we see our role as facilitating, but then offering certain techniques or certain approaches, as I said before, organization and access. That is something which has to happen without us. So there is a need to say, okay, we are not involved every day and for the future. So you have to leave it, actually, like make sure that it works exactly by itself. And if it doesn't, then that's where you know you've done something wrong. But coming back, I would say just hoping that what you're doing has a direct and beneficial impact. And if it doesn't, then there's a miscommunication between the NGO and us, and the NGO and the community, and us and the community, and then it's something which there's a whole series of questions which we then go back and seek the answers for. So it's pretty much.
Something else? Okay, thank you very much for your lecture, for your 2 lectures. Thank you very much for your work, and we expect you to come back again here.
And it'd be a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.